The history of witchcraft is not a straight line, it is a spiral. It winds through the caves of our Paleolithic ancestors, twists through the smoke of the Inquisition, and re-emerges vibrant and digital on the screens of the 21st century. It is a narrative written in invisible ink on the margins of the world's great empires, a story of power, fear, gender, and the relentless human desire to force the hand of fate. To understand the witch, at times a healer, at times a monster, and finally an icon of rebellion, we must strip away the green skin and the pointed hats of Hollywood. We must look into the mirror of history and see the witch not as a villain, but as a lightning rod for the anxieties of the human species. From the flickering firelight of the ancient world to the cold glow of a smartphone, the figure of the witch has always been with us. This is that story. Long before the word witch was whispered in fear, there was simply the wise one. Imagine the earliest human settlements 30,000 years ago. The world was a terrifying, incomprehensible place, governed by invisible forces. The storm that destroyed a shelter, the sickness that ravaged a child, the migration of the herds. These were not random events to the ancient mind. They were the will of spirits. In this chaotic void, certain individuals stepped forward. They were the bridge between the physical and the spiritual. These were the shamans. They were the first doctors, the first priests, and the first scientists. Their magic was practical, born of survival. It was the knowledge that willow bark could ease pain, or that red ochre could staunch a wound. But to the uninitiated, knowledge is magic. This was the era of sympathetic magic, the belief that like influences like. A hunter might draw a bison on a cave wall and spear it, believing the ritual would ensure a kill in the real world. Archaeological finds, such as the Venus figurines, statues of voluptuous women found across Europe, suggest that early magic was deeply tied to fertility and the feminine mystery of birth. In the frozen north of Scandinavia, this tradition crystallized into Seder. Seder was a magic of prophecy and fate, primarily practiced by women known as vulva. Unlike the warrior men who sought to conquer the world with steel, the vulva sought to influence it by spinning the threads of destiny. Legend tells that even Odin, the all-father of the Norse gods, practiced Seder. However, this was considered scandalous, a feminine art practiced by a male god. Here, in the mists of the Iron Age, we see the first seeds of the gender divide that would eventually burn across Europe. Men use weapons, women use magic. As humanity built the great civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece, magic became formalized. It moved from the cave to the temple. However, a crucial distinction emerged here, a dividing line that would haunt the history of witchcraft forever. The war between Þurgi and Goetia. Þurgi, or high magic, was the domain of the elite, priests, philosophers, and kings. It was ritualistic, complex, and intended to purify the soul or contact divine beings. It was clean magic, often involving elaborate mathematics and astronomy. When a priest in Babylon read the flight of birds to advise the king, that was religion. Goetia, or low magic, was the magic of the streets. It was the domain of the common people, often women and slaves. It was the charm to cure a toothache, the potion to make a neighbour fall in love, the curse scratched onto a lead tablet and buried in a grave. In ancient Greece, the word for witchcraft was pharmakeia. This is a complex term meaning both poison and cure, and is also the root of our modern word pharmacy. The witch was the one who knew the herbs. She could save your life or end it. The Greeks and Romans feared maleficium, or harmful magic. Across the Roman world, archaeologists have found thousands of depictions, curse tablets. These were sheets of lead inscribed with binding spells and buried in wells or graves. In 450 BCE, the Roman 12 Tables established the first anti-witchcraft laws, but crucially, the Romans didn't care about the soul of the witch. They were pragmatic. They cared about property damage. If you used magic to heal your family, you were wise. If you used it to blight your neighbour's crops, you were a criminal. There was no devil in Roman law. There was only damages and liability. As the Roman Empire crumbled and Christianity spread across Europe, the narrative began to shift. But surprisingly to modern readers, the early church did not hunt witches. It mocked them. St. Augustine of Hippo, 354 to 430 CE, the great theologian, argued a point that would hold for nearly 1,000 years. Since God is all-powerful, the devil cannot grant real power to humans. Therefore, magic is an illusion. This skepticism was codified in the Canon Episcopi. This ecclesiastical law declared that women who believed they flew at night on the backs of beasts with the pagan goddess Diana were suffering from hallucinations sent by the devil to trick them. The crime wasn't doing magic. The crime was being foolish enough to believe you were doing it. For centuries, this era of unbelief protected the wise women of Europe. The witch was seen as a superstitious fool, not a satanic threat. But the pendulum was about to swing. As the Middle Ages waned, the atmosphere in Europe curdled. A series of catastrophes struck that would shatter the Church's confidence and the people's sanity, creating the breeding ground for the Great Witch Hunt. Temperatures dropped significantly across Europe, causing massive, inexplicable crop failures. This was the Little Ice Age. Glaciers advanced, swallowing alpine villages. The people asked, "Why is God punishing us?" To add to this devastation came the Black Death and the 100 Years' War. The bubonic plague wiped out a third of the European population. Constant conflict bled nations dry. Social order had collapsed. A society in trauma looks for scapegoats. The Church, facing internal heresy, like the Cathars and Waldensians, and external threats, needed to consolidate control. The theological narrative changed. Thomas Aquinas began to argue that demons could interact physically with the world. In 1307, the French king Philip IV needed to destroy the Knights Templar to erase his massive debts to the order. He accused them not just of financial crimes, but of sorcery, spitting on the cross, and worshipping a goat-headed idol. Under brutal torture, the knights confessed to these absurdities. This was the blueprint. The authorities learned a terrifying lesson from this history. With enough pain, they could make anyone confess to a diabolical conspiracy. They just needed a new target. The spark that lit the pyres of Europe was a book, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. It was written by Heinrich Kramer, a bitter German inquisitor. Kramer had recently been humiliated in Innsbruck, where a local bishop had thrown him out of court for being senile and crazy, due to his obsession with the sexual habits of the accused women. Seeking revenge and validation, Kramer wrote the Malleus. It was a toxic masterpiece of misogyny and paranoia, aided by the newly invented printing press, which allowed it to spread like a virus. It argued 3 devastating points that rewrote the legal code of Europe. The first, witchcraft is real. It reversed the Canon Episcopi, claiming that denying the existence of witches was now heresy. The second, women are the source. Kramer famously claimed the word femina. Woman comes from fee, faith, and minus, less. He argued women were carnal, intellectually weak, and thus the natural gateway for the devil. And the third, the pact. It redefined witchcraft. The village healer was no longer just mixing herbs, she was making a formal pact with Satan. The Malleus introduced the concept of the witch's Sabbath, a twisted parody of the Christian Mass where witches allegedly kissed the devil's anus, osculum infame, devoured unbaptized babies, and danced naked. This turned witchcraft from a solitary petty crime into a vast, invisible, existential war against God. We now enter the era known as the Burning Times. Contrary to popular belief, the height of the witch hunts was not the Dark Ages, but the early modern period. Just as Newton was discovering gravity, Descartes was defining reason, and Shakespeare was writing Hamlet, Europe was setting women on fire. The hunts were not a uniform blanket of terror. They were wildfires that flared up in specific regions, usually driven by a specific witch hunter, a local magistrate, or a sudden frost that killed the vines. The legal machinery was designed to ensure conviction. In England, under common law, torture was technically illegal, and witches were hanged, not burned. But on the continent, France, Germany, Scotland, Roman law applied, which allowed for torture to extract a confession. The accusation usually stemmed from a denial of charity. A wealthy neighbour refuses a beggar woman some milk. The beggar mutters a curse. The cow dies. Guilt transforms into accusation. There were several methods to determine if one was a witch or not. Professional prickers used long needles to find the witch's mark, a spot on the body insensitive to pain and lacking blood. This was often a scar, a birthmark, or a supernumerary nipple. Prickers were known to use retractable needles to fake the results, ensuring a fee. The accused was bound thumb to toe and thrown into water. If she floated, the water had rejected her. She was guilty. If she sank, She was innocent, though she might drown. The Holy Roman Empire saw the worst of it. In the Bamberg witch trials, 1626 to 1631, over 900 people were burned. The Prince-Bishop confiscated the property of the victims, making the hunt a profitable enterprise. He burned his own nephew, 19 priests and 7 children. King James VI, later James I of England, became obsessed with witches after storms battered his ship. He personally oversaw the torture of Agnes Sampson in the North Berwick trials. He wrote Demonology, a guide to hunting witches, which he later brought to England. In 1609, the French judge Pierre de l'Ancre arrived in the Basque country. He was horrified by the freedom of Basque women and their love of the sea. He burned 70 people, convinced that the entire population gathered on the beaches to mate with Satan in the form of a goat. To understand the horror, we must zoom in on one voice. In 1628, Johannes Junius, the mayor of Bamberg, was accused. He was a wealthy, pious man. From his prison cell, despite his broken hands, he smuggled out a letter to his daughter. It remains one of the most heartbreaking documents in history. It reads in part, "Many 100,000 good nights, dearly beloved daughter Veronica. Innocent have I come into prison. Innocent must I be tortured. Innocent must I die. Whoever comes into the witch prison must become a witch, or be tortured until he invents something out of his head." Junius describes how the executioner pleaded with him, "Sir, I beg you for God's sake confess something, whether it be true or not. I cannot stop the torture until you do." Eventually Junius confessed. He admitted to a pact with a demon named Viana. He was burned at the stake. His story reveals the truth of the trials. It was a machine that manufactured guilt. Was there any truth to the witch's flight? Modern pharmacology offers a clue. Historical records of the flying ointment seized from witches often list specific ingredients: deadly nightshade, henbane, mandrake, and monkshood. These plants contain tropane alkaloids. These are potent hallucinogens. If ingested, they are fatal. However, if mixed with a fat such as goose grease and applied to the mucous membranes, they bypass the digestive system. The effects of tropane alkaloids include the sensation of flying, encounters with beast-like entities, and wild, erotic delirium. It is highly probable that some witches were herbalists using these transdermal hallucinogens for shamanic experiences. The broomstick legend likely stems from the method of applying the salve to sensitive areas. The Inquisition took these drug-induced spirit journeys and interpreted them literally as physical flight to the devil's Sabbath. As the hysteria waned in Europe, it found one last gasp in the Americas. The Salem witch trials, 1692, are the most famous, though statistically minor when compared to the atrocities in Europe. Salem was a perfect storm of Puritan repression, fear of indigenous attacks, and social contagion. The use of spectral evidence, testimony that a spirit invisible to everyone else was attacking the victim, made defence impossible. By the late 17th century, the Enlightenment brought a new god, reason. The laws against witchcraft were repealed. The fires went out. But the witch did not vanish. She went underground. The 19th century was an era of paradox. As the Industrial Revolution turned the world into a grey machine of steam and steel, people craved mystery. In 1848, the Fox sisters in New York claimed to communicate with spirits via rappings. This sparked a global craze. Séances became the parlour game of the Victorian elite. A French occultist, Eliphas Lévy, attempted to treat magic as a science. He drew the famous image of Baphomet, not as a devil, but as a symbol of balance, male/female, human/animal, as above/so below. In 1887, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was founded in London. This secret society, which included poet W.B. Yeats and Aleister Crowley, synthesized the Kabbalah, tarot, and Egyptian magic into a complex system of self-improvement. They stripped magic of its peasant roots and dressed it in high-minded ritual. They laid the groundwork for the modern definition of magic, the art of changing consciousness at will. In 1921, anthropologist Margaret Murray published The Witch Cult in Western Europe. She argued that the victims of the trials were not devil worshippers, but practitioners of a surviving pre-Christian fertility religion. While modern historians have debunked her specific claims, as there was no organized pan-European pagan cult, her idea was electric. It gave the witch a noble lineage. In the 1950s, Gerald Gardner, an English civil servant, claimed to have been initiated into a surviving coven in the New Forest. He founded Wicca. Gardnerian Wicca was a synthesis of folk magic, Masonic ritual, and Eastern philosophy. It was a religion of nature, duotheistic and governed by the ethical instruction, and it harm none, do what ye will. Gardner changed the face of the witch. She was no longer the ugly crone, she was the priestess of nature. The 1960s changed everything. The witch moved from the woods to the protest line. Feminists recognized the witch hunts as a history of gendercide, a systematic attack on independent women. In 1968, the collective, WITCH, Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, stormed Wall Street in witch costumes, hexing the stock market to protest capitalism and patriarchy. In the Spiral Dance, 1979, witchcraft was linked to environmentalism. The witch became the defender of the earth against the ravages of industry. History is a spiral, however, and the fear returned. In the 1980s, America was gripped by the Satanic Panic. Daycare centers were accused of ritual abuse. Heavy metal music was labeled demonic. It was a modern witch hunt, fueled by the same spectral evidence and mass hysteria as Salem. It proved that the archetype of the evil witch is buried deep in the human psyche, waiting to be triggered. Today, we're living in a witchcraft renaissance. #WitchTok brings magic to billions. The aesthetic has shifted from the crone to the empowered, intuitive healer. Modern witchcraft is vast and decentralized. Secular witches use spells as psychological framing tools, placebo effect with style. Traditional witches attempt to reconstruct the specific, often darker, folk practices of their ancestors. The binding of political figures has revived the ancient use of magic as a tool of the voiceless against the powerful. Why does the witch survive? Why, after the fires, the tortures, the ridicule, and the age of science, do we still return to this archetype? Because the witch represents agency. In the cave, the shaman claimed agency over the terror of the storm. In the medieval village, the midwife claimed agency over the body. In the burning times, the accused represented a fear of agency that the state could not control. And today, in a world that feels increasingly chaotic and fractured, threatened by climate, pandemics, and social isolation, the witch reaches out to the universe and says, I am not a bystander. I have the power to shape my reality. The history of witchcraft is not just a history of magic. It is the history of the marginalized reclaiming their power. It is a story written in blood, smoke, and starlight. And as long as humans gaze at the moon and wish for something more, the story will continue.